Chapter 2111. Waylon stood up. Let's go. We'll figure out how to get out of here later. After Cameron finished packing up her stuff, she snuffed out the fire. They then left through another pathway. On the other side, Mahina was searching the woods with a group of people. Knowles walked to an empty space and squatted down to observe the surroundings. Mahina came up to him and asked, "Did you find something, Mr. Knowles?" He stretched his hand forward and touched the ground. Somebody has lit up a fire here. This scorched wood is still warm. Mahina was stunned. It must be Mr. Southern and Mr. Goldman. Knowles rose to his feet. Let's find a way to contact them first. At least, we need to let them know it's us who are looking for them. Apparently, they thought they were their enemies, so they ran away quickly. Knowles surmised that one of them must be injured. Otherwise, they would have hidden and observed the situation instead of running away. Meanwhile, Cameron and Waylon finally reached the end of the woods. After they came out of the woods, what appeared before them was the rocky reef and stormy sea. Suddenly, it began to rain. Cameron threw the jacket in her hand on Waylon and said, "Put this on. You mustn't get your wound wet." After that, she rushed to the front to look for a way out. The pitter-patter slowly grew into a torrent. Waylon draped the jacket on himself, and a stinging pain spread from the wound on his arm. The white gauze had long been stained with dried blood. Cameron stood on the rock, and as if she saw something, she shouted, "There's a village up ahead." The rain was getting heavier. A curtain of rain invaded even the dense woods, and Mahina and Knowles had no other choice but to halt their search and find a cave to escape the rain. Standing in front of the cave, Knowles looked at the rain dripping down from the roof of the cave into the mossy rock crevices. Jake handed a bottle of water to him and said, "We haven't seen anyone from the other side all the way here, so I think Mr. Southern and Mr. Goldman should be safe." He took over the bottle of water and twisted it open. "Maybe." Mahina came forward with a phone in her hand. "The reception is poor here. What about you guys?" Jake pulled his phone out and shook his head. "I wonder where Mr. Southern and Mr. Goldman are now," Mahina asked worriedly. Knowles turned around and said, "No matter how big the woods are on this island, they can't go out to sea." Jake suddenly remembered something and said, "Oh yeah, I remember there is a fish village near the woods. Do you think they'll go there?" Outside the compound of the house were fishing nets hung on bamboo poles and some engine parts of fishing boats. There was a cage nearby that kept poultry. Waylon scanned across the house. The furniture was simple and old. Even the TV was a model more than 10 years old. Cameron stood at the door and dried herself by shaking the raindrops off her jacket. The good thing was that the shirt inside wasn't soaked. An old lady came out of the kitchen with 2 bowls of hot porridge and said, "Both of you are wet. Come, have some porridge to warm yourself up." "Thank you, madam," Cameron replied with a smile on her face. She walked up to the table and sat down. The table was made from wood. It became damp during rainy days and had dark mold marks on it, but it did not affect much. The old lady smiled and asked, "Are you guys visitors?" Cameron nodded. "Yeah. Do you live here alone?" "I live with my husband, but he is headed to the sea with the people from the village for fishing. But with such heavy rain, I'm afraid he won't be able to return for a while," replied the old lady. Waylon looked at her and chimed in. "Are there only so many people in this village?" He only saw a dozen or so families when he was on his way here. It was nothing compared to the city of the Southern clan. Chapter 2112. Cameron took a sip from the porridge and replied, "It's true. There are only this many people in this fishing village. The youngsters have all left the eastern islands, and those who stayed behind are old people. A very small number of middle-aged people refuse to leave because of their parents, so they stay on the islands to do fishing business." The old lady nodded and sighed. "Most of us in the village are poor illegal immigrants from Eurasia. If it hadn't been for Mr. Southern Sr., to take us to the islands and allow the men in the village the opportunity to work in the fishing business so that we could earn some money to support our families. We wouldn't know where we would be now. The old lady had a son and daughter too, but they were working in Eurasia and would come back to visit them from time to time. However, they were old. They couldn't go so far with their son and daughter anymore, so they had to stay on the eastern islands. Waylon looked at Cameron but did not say anything. After Cameron finished her porridge, she asked, "Can I have another one, madam? Your porridge tastes so sweet." The old lady chuckled and replied, "Sure. I'll go get one more portion for you." The old lady was friendly. Perhaps she was too lonely, so she was happy when she had guests. When Cameron realized that Waylon was staring at her, she asked, "Why are you looking at me like that?" He squinted and said, "I didn't expect that your father would be the one who helped them here in this fishing village." His grandfather had told him before what kind of person Sonny was. Before he came here, he was skeptical about it. After all, it was very rare for someone like Sonny, who was an influential figure in the underworld, to be compassionate. She clicked her tongue and said, "My father is a kind-hearted man. He values friendship and loyalty over everything else. If not, why would he keep an eye closed toward the serpent's action?" Waylon chuckled. "It seems to me that you don't like the way he handles the serpents very much. He's old and has grown soft. I've told him before that if he wants to be generous to other people, the first thing he has to make sure of is that the person will appreciate it. Benevolence is a breeding ground for wild ambition, and the serpents are the best example." After that, she added, "But he's my father, so I don't blame him for being soft. It's just that as long as I'm here, no one will be able to take advantage of the southern clan." Waylon pressed his lips thin. She was even wiser than she looked. Perhaps Sonny thought the same way she did in the past. It was just that he was already old. He did not want to fight for those useless things anymore, and he wanted to have peace. Just like his great-grandfather, who once valued nothing more than his own interests. However, after spending most of his life trying to get the things he wanted to do, he felt more and more indebted to the people around him and wanted to make up for it in the time he had left. The old lady brought the porridge out of the kitchen. Cameron rose to her feet and took over the porridge. "Thank you very much. Your porridge tastes really good." The old lady said, "I still have some more in the kitchen. If you still want some more, you can go inside and get it yourself." She looked outside and continued, "The rain has stopped, so I have to go back to work." After that, she walked into the courtyard. Cameron turned her head around and saw that Waylon hadn't touched his porridge yet. She asked, "What's wrong? Are you still full from the canned food last night?" "No." He touched the table, and Cameron instantly saw the light. "You should be grateful that you have something to eat now, Mr. Goldman." After the rain stopped, the entire island seemed to have been cleansed. The sky was clear, and even the air was infused with the smell of mud and trees. Sonny was inside his study and seemed worried. He couldn't read anything from the newspaper, so he took down his glasses and massaged his nose. The butler came into the study with his lunch and said, "Mr. Southern Sr., you should eat something." "Just put it over there," he replied tiredly. The butler put the food to one side and said, "I'm sure Mr. Southern and Mr. Goldman are good people. I'm sure they'll come back safely." Chapter 2113. "I'm not worried about them." Sonny raised his head. "They're smart, so I'm sure they can solve their own problem. What I'm worried about is the other people." The butler knew what he was talking about. "Are you worried that Fabio will make a move?" Sonny's face sank. "If Fabio really joins forces with Donald, we might not be a match for them. Besides, our enemies are hiding in the dark while we're in the light. It's very obvious that they're preparing to have a war with us, judging from what they did to Cam. They'll think we're a bunch of pushovers if we don't do anything." After he finished speaking, he rose to his feet and said, "I'm going to the hospital." It was about time to get rid of Manuel. Once again, Sonny came to the hospital to pay Jochen a visit. Jochen could sit on the bed right now, but he still couldn't walk yet. When he saw Sonny, he was surprised. Sonny put his jacket on the back of the chair and sat down. I'll go straight to the point. Jochen, I'm sure you already know that it's Manuel who betrayed you, right? Jochen lowered his head, and a disappointed expression sat on his face. I didn't expect him to do that at all. He did that to you because he has been working with Donald the whole time behind your back. What? Jochen was stunned. Sonny took out the account book of the commune and put it on the table. As Jochen flipped through the account book, Sonny said, these are all the transaction records that show that Manuel has been cooperating with Donald since a year ago. Sonny had already shown him the truth, and Jochen had no other choice but to believe it. His hands were shaking. He found it hard to believe that the man he had been raising for so many years had been planning to betray him since a year ago. He has detained Florence. Jochen's face turned even darker when he heard what Sonny said. How dare he? Everyone in the Serpents thinks you are dead. That's why they followed her instructions and defected to Fabio. However, you're the leader of the Serpents, and I'm sure all of them will listen to you. Jochen suppressed his anger and asked, what do you want me to do? Sonny looked at him and said, you can still write, right? Can you write a letter to someone you trust the most and who is familiar with your handwriting? After a short while, Sonny came out of the ward. He handed the letter to one of his men in the corridor. Bring this letter to Matteo. The man took the letter and left hurriedly. When Sonny and two of his men emerged from the hospital, they saw two vans parked at the hospital's main entrance. Manuel stepped out of the van, followed by a few burly men. All of them were holding steel pipes in their hands and quickly surrounded Sonny and his men. The passers-by were startled. They hurriedly left the place as they did not want to get into trouble. Manuel tossed the man Sonny had sent away to deliver the letter on the ground next to Sonny. He was ambushed, and Manuel had taken away the letter. Manuel placed the letter in front of Sonny and said, so it's you who saved Jochen, Mr. Southern Sr. No wonder I couldn't find his dead body. Manuel, you shouldn't be so greedy, Sonny said expressionlessly. Manuel shredded the letter into pieces and threw it on the ground. As the wind carried the shreds of paper away, he said, do you really think that Jochen can still be the leader for the Serpents even if he's still alive? Sonny looked at him without saying anything. All of your men have gone to look for Cameron, right? You have only 2 fighters left to protect you. Unfortunately, you and Jochen won't be able to get out of here alive today. Chapter 2114. Manuel was confident that Sonny would dispatch all his men to look for Cameron when she went missing. No matter how great Sonny was as a fighter, he was not as good as he used to be since he was already old, so he would get exhausted very soon. If he could get rid of the leader of the Southern clan and Jochen in one sitting, dealing with Cameron would be a piece of cake. Sonny chuckled. You're too young, Manuel. Manuel's face sank as he barked out his order, go get him. The 2 men standing behind Sonny rushed forward and engaged them in a melee. Manuel did not just stay at the back either. He pulled out a dagger and threw himself at Sonny while he was not watching. However, Sonny was not an easy target. Even though he was old, his experience and his martial arts skills had given him an edge over Manuel. After they exchanged a few blows, Manuel was slowly getting overwhelmed. The other 2 fighters hastily came over to assist Manuel, and 3 of them fought against Sonny. People always said that a lion couldn't win against a group of hyenas. Sonny was caught off guard by a hit on his back by a steel pipe. He stumbled a few steps forward and nearly fell to the ground. He turned around and slammed a punch into the temple of the attacker, causing the man to tilt over and fall to the ground. Seizing his chance, Manuel raised his dagger and stabbed into Sonny's shoulder. Sonny let out a stifled grunt. He grabbed the blade that was stuck in his shoulder and pulled it out forcefully. As blood jutted out of the wound into the air, he struck Manuel's jaw with a palm strike, sending him flying into the air with blood flowing out of his lips and nose. Mr. Southern Sr., one of his men wanted to help him, but he was hit in the leg with an iron pipe by the person behind him. He fell to one knee and dodged another attack. He couldn't get himself out. Sonny was already reaching his limit. His shoulder was bleeding profusely, and he could barely stand. Manuel wiped the blood off his face with the back of his hand and smiled devilishly. "Old thing, I'd like to see who can save you this time." Holding his dagger in his hand, Manuel rushed toward Sonny. Just when the dagger was about to land on its target, a bullet darted from the shadows and sent the dagger flying away from his hand with a loud clang. Manuel grabbed his numb arm, and his face changed in shock. "Someone is here." At that moment, a car darted straight at them. A few people were knocked away by the car because they were caught in the fight. Manuel was lucky enough to dodge in time. Gritting his teeth, he abandoned his men and took the opportunity to escape. The remaining people thought the reinforcements from the southern clan had arrived, so all of them ran away as well. Daisy's hands were shaking profusely in the car as she held tightly to the steering wheel. She still couldn't come around from the shock that she had just hit someone with a car. She unbuckled her seatbelt, pushed open the car door, and got out of the car. She felt weak on her knees and could barely stand. Sonny's subordinate hastily went forward to support Sonny. Even though he was wounded, his injuries were not serious. When he saw Daisy, he was shocked. "Miss Vanderbilt?" Daisy came around to her senses and rushed up to them. Her face turned pale when she saw the blood on Sonny's shirt. "Mr. Southern Sr., you're injured." Sonny covered the wound on his shoulder with his hand. His face was bloodless, but he still comforted her. "Don't worry. I'll be fine." The silver lining was that they were right in front of the hospital, so Sonny was rushed to the emergency department. While Daisy and two of Sonny's men were waiting in front of the door, Daisy saw that they were injured too, so she said, "Why don't you guys also go get your wounds tended?" One of them smiled and replied, "We're not as seriously injured as Mr. Southern Sr., so we'll be fine." As if he remembered something, he asked, "By the way, Miss Vanderbilt, how did you know we're in the hospital?" Daisy did not know how to answer the question. She had received a text message from Sadie 15 minutes ago and learned that Sonny was in trouble at the hospital. At that time, she did not think too much and rushed to the hospital immediately. Nolace, Cameron, Waylon, and Mahina were not around. If something were to happen to Sonny, how should she explain it to everyone? Besides, she wanted to do something for them as well. Even if they might not need her help, she did not want to be a freeloader who couldn't do anything. Chapter 2115. The doctor came out, and they hastily asked, "How is Mr. Southern Sr.?" The doctor took off his mask and said, "Don't worry. Mr. Southern Sr. will be fine. We've already stitched the wound. Just make sure that he has enough rest and doesn't get any water on the wound in the next few days. After a week, he can come back here and get the stitches removed." Daisy pushed the door open and entered the ward. She saw that Sonny was lying on the bed, receiving an infusion while his pale face was filled with fatigue. She dared not to imagine what would happen if she had come a little later. Sonny's men walked inside and said, "Don't worry, Miss Vanderbilt. Mr. Southern Sr. will be fine." She nodded and asked, "By the way, what is Mr. Southern Sr. doing in the hospital?" The man replied, "Mr. Southern Sr. is here to look for Jokin." Daisy was startled. "Jokin is still alive?" He nodded. Manuel planned to kill Jokin, but Neil saved him. After he finished speaking, he sighed and continued. "We didn't expect that Manuel would ambush us at the hospital. If it weren't for someone's help from the side, Mr. Southern Sr. might be in danger." Daisy lowered her head. She suspected that the person who helped them from the side was Sadie. She pressed her lips tightly and said, "Since Manuel couldn't get what he wanted today, I'm sure he'll make his moves again. It isn't safe for them to stay at the hospital anymore, but we don't have enough people right now." Daisy looked at Sonny on the bed, and something flashed across her head. "I have an idea." In the evening, at the fishing village, the old lady enthusiastically told them to stay for the night. It was already late, and there was no transport back to the town anymore. Since Waylon was injured, Cameron agreed, and they stayed for one night. The sky had gotten even darker after they finished their dinner. The old lady cleaned up a room for them and said, "This was originally my son's room, but he hasn't been back for many years. You'll have to settle for one night." There was not much furniture in the room. There was nothing else in the room besides a single bed, a closet, a table, a chair, and an old-fashioned ceiling fan. The room was not equipped with air conditioning either. Cameron was stunned. "Wait a moment, madam." The old lady was already gone when she turned her head around and was about to say something. "How are we supposed to sleep since there is only a room and a bed?" Waylon came into the room and said, "Well, we have no choice but to settle for one night." Cameron looked at the single bed and asked, "Are you really sure about that?" Waylon sat on the bed and looked at Cameron silently. She took a deep breath and waved her hand. "Fine, you're injured. You can have the bed. I'll sleep on the floor." The good thing was that there was a cool mat in the room and extra pillows in the closet. She could even sleep in the woods, so she could sleep on the floor as well. After she laid the cool mat on the floor and just when she was about to lie down, she saw something flitted across the bottom of the cupboard, creating a lot of noise in it. Cameron looked down, and then a mouse suddenly leaped out of the dark. "Arg! A mouse!" She threw herself on the bed and accidentally landed on Waylon's leg. Hissing with pain, Waylon hastily supported himself by putting his arm on the bed behind him. Cameron got up from Waylon and sat at the side of the bed. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." Waylon slowly loosened his arm muscles and raised his head to look at her. This was something he had never seen before, so he teased her. "This is new. I didn't know that you're scared of mice. Don't you find mice gross? They find their food in the garbage and spend most of their time crawling through the sewers. What if they crawled on top of me in the middle of the night? Just thinking about it makes me sick." Cameron rubbed her arms as goosebumps began to pop up on her skin. Waylon chuckled helplessly. Suddenly, Cameron went closer to him. She crawled to the spot next to Waylon and found that the bed could fit two of them. She patted the bed and said, "Would you mind sharing one side of the bed with me, Mr. Goldman?" Chapter 2116. Waylon hesitated slightly. Are you shy?" Cameron looked at him and raised her eyebrows lightly. "Don't worry. I won't do anything to you. Just treat me like a man." Waylon was at a loss for words. Cameron arranged her pillows, and in order to make room for him, she lay on her side with her back facing him and then added, "I don't move much when I'm asleep. You have my word that I won't be touching you while you're sleeping, so don't worry." Waylon smiled helplessly, smoothed the blanket on his body, and lay down on his back. The small single bed was indeed a little too crowded for two people, and it was almost impossible to turn over at will. Cameron lay on her side and left a little gap between the two of them, most probably fearing that she would get into contact with the wound on his arm. Waylon stared at the ceiling for a long time, then turned his head to the side and looked at the woman lying beside him with her back facing him. "You really don't mind this at all, huh?" She was flustered, and then rested her elbow under the side of her head. "What's there to mind? This is not my first time sleeping on the same bed with another man. I've eaten and stayed under the same roof with 5 or 6 men before." He frowned. "Didn't they get suspicious of your identity?" Cameron stared at the corner of the room. "Why would they suspect me? In their eyes, I'm their young master. They would talk to me as if they were talking to a tiger, so who would have the guts to doubt my identity?" Waylon smirked. "You're correct in that sense too." He then slightly turned over to his side of the bed to make more space. After the lights went out, the room was pitch black. The two were lying on the same bed, and neither had spoken since then. In fact, Cameron could not fall asleep at all, and she did not dare to turn over at will either. When she went to sea and stayed under the roof with those subordinates, she did not feel embarrassed. Perhaps it was because those men treated her like a man and did not even know she was a woman. But things were a little different with Waylon. He knew her identity, and that was why she felt a little embarrassed. However, most probably because she did not get to rest well in the woods last night, she soon became drowsy and fell asleep. What she did not know was that Waylon could not sleep throughout the night. After all, it was his first time sharing a bed with a woman. Cameron did not move all night, and she was extremely cautious, even when she was sleeping. She remained still in the position that she fell asleep in for a long time. But someone was worried that she would roll off the bed because she turned over while she was sleeping and looked back at her 4 to 5 times. Waylon placed the back of his hand against his forehead. Sure enough, not every woman sleeps as restlessly as Daisy does. Meanwhile, at the hospital, when the elevator door opened, the nurse was going through some documents at the nurse station. 2 doctors in white robes and masks walked out of the elevator, passed by the station, and knocked on the table. "Which ward is Mr. Serrano in?" The nurse answered them without even lifting her head. "Ward 63. The 2 men came to the door of Ward 63, skimmed through the patient's chart, and determined that it was indeed Jochen. The 2 exchanged gazes and pushed the door open. Through the dim light in the corridor, they saw the man lying on the hospital bed with his back facing the door. He seemed to be sleeping soundly and not making any movement. One of the men pulled a dagger out of his robe, walked up to the bed, and stabbed the person on the bed accurately. Sensing something immediately after the stab, the man turned over the person on the bed. It was a silicone dummy. "Fuck. We've been played." They quickly fled, but as soon as they got out of the ward, they saw several men coming out of the room next to the ward. They turned around and saw 3 men holding daggers and blocking their way into the corridor behind them. The other party came at them from both ends of the corridor. The 2 men gnashed their teeth, bit the bullet, took out their daggers, and sprinted toward the men. They were outnumbered, and the 2 of them were quickly captured. Chapter 2117. Daisy walked out from behind the group of men. One of the assassins was stunned and realized something. "Aren't you the nurse at the nurse station?" Daisy squinted and smirked. "Then are you doctors only because you're wearing white coats?" The men were at a loss for words. They had wanted to sneak into the hospital in the middle of the night to murder Jochen, but they did not expect these people to wait here to ambush them ahead of time. It was estimated that the people who had gone after Sunny had also failed. It was dawn, and a ray of sunlight shone into the room through a crack in the window. Because Cameron had been sleeping in one position, her entire arm was numb when she woke up. She turned over subconsciously and found that there was another blanket on her body, and the other side of the bed was empty. When she rubbed her hand against the space of the bed, there was not even a trace of residual warmth. "It seems that he's woken up a lot earlier." Cameron did some basic stretching, got out of bed, and walked out of the room groggily. However, before she could get into the living room, she heard the voice of the old lady who let them into her house. Cameron lifted the curtains, went out, and saw breakfast on the table. At this time, the old lady came out of the kitchen carrying more dishes, and saw her. "Girl, you've woken up." Cameron stared at the exquisite food on the table. "These are..." "Oh, these are your boyfriend's masterpieces." "My boy." "Boyfriend?" Cameron was taken aback. The old lady laughed. "Aren't the 2 of you a couple? By the way, your boyfriend's cooking skills are top-notch. You really have good eyes. You've actually found yourself such a handsome boyfriend who can cook. You'll definitely live a life full of delicious meals after you get married in the future." The corner of Cameron's lips twitched, and she covered her forehead. "Madam, you've misunderstood. We're not in that kind of relationship." Waylon came out of the kitchen with the last dish and placed it on the table. The old lady seemed to have not heard Cameron's explanation and started praising Waylon. "So sorry to have to bother you so early in the morning. You even have to help me make breakfast." Waylon let off an amiable smile. "You're exaggerating, madam. You're the one who took us in for the night." We're the ones who bothered you, so you don't need to feel embarrassed to ask me to help you make breakfast. Seeing that he was such a sensible young man, the old lady grinned from ear to ear. Cameron sat in the seat and looked at the scrumptious and appetizing breakfast on the table. She picked up the silverware and tasted it, and her eyes lit up. She then stared up at Waylon. "You're quite good at cooking, Mr. Goldman. These are comparable to the breakfast made by chefs from high-end restaurants." Waylon filled a bowl with some oatmeal. "My mother was a busy woman when I was young, so in order to share her burden, I was usually the one who made breakfast." Cameron was startled. "Aren't there servants in the Goldman mansion? Why would you need to make breakfast?" "Just like me, I've never entered the kitchen to cook, because we have cooks at home who are specially tasked to cook us meals. Forget about me. Even my father can't make a decent breakfast at his age." Waylon stirred the oatmeal in his bowl with a spoon, and his eyes moved. "We hadn't gone back to the Goldman at that time." Cameron choked on her own words. "I shouldn't have dug so deep when it comes to somebody else's family affairs." After breakfast, both of them bid the old lady goodbye. The old lady was so enthusiastic and affectionate that she gave them 2 chickens she had raised by herself. Cameron was too embarrassed to refuse her kindness, so she accepted it. Walking to the side of the road, Waylon stretched out his hand. "Give them to me. I'll carry them." "No, it's just 2 chickens." She pushed his hand away. "You're injured, so act like someone that's injured, and don't worry about such petty matters." Cameron lifted the 2 cages and knocked on the doors. "When we get home, I'll make chicken broth out of the 2 of you." The chickens in the cage glared straight at her. Chapter 2118. Cameron tooted. "How dare you glare at me? Do you believe that I'll pluck all your feathers out now?" Seeing that she was so into competing and having fun with the 2 chickens, Waylon smiled and shook his head. The 2 stood on the side of the road and waited for a ride. After a while, a tractor drove past. The tractor was heading for Southernshire, so Waylon and Cameron got onto the tractor for a ride. The sun shone on the 2 of them, there was no shelter, and the road was bumpy. Thus, the journey back home could be said to be extremely tormenting. When the tractor arrived at the intersection in front of the town, the 2 got out of the vehicle, and Cameron sprinted to the side of the road, leaned forward, propped her arms against a tree, and vomited. Waylon gave all the change that he had on him to the driver. The driver took a glimpse at Cameron and asked, "Is your wife pregnant? Why is she vomiting so badly?" Waylon cleared his throat awkwardly, but before he could say anything, the driver had already handed him the 2 cages. "Go back and slaughter one of them, then cook something to make it up for your wife." He then drove the tractor away. Cameron threw up all the breakfast she had eaten in the morning and felt extremely uncomfortable. Waylon handed her a pack of tissues. "Are you all right?" She grabbed it from him and waved. "I'm fine. It's just motion sickness." He smiled. "Then I must say that you're quite perseverant, Mr. Southern. You actually managed not to vomit on the tractor." She wiped the corners of her mouth, turned around, and glared at him. "Are you mocking me?" Waylon laughed out loud but didn't utter a single word. Cameron did not go into the details with him and grabbed the chickens from him. "Let's go." He stopped her. "Wait a minute." Cameron turned around in confusion, and a coat was placed over her head. She then stared at him as he patiently tied the sleeves of his coat into a knot, wrapping her long hair in it. She lifted her hand, patted the hand, made temporary hijab on her head, and was slightly astonished. Waylon looked at her. "I can barely see your hair now. I don't think you would want to go back and be seen like this, would you?" Cameron lowered her gaze. "It turns out that he's worried about my identity being exposed. That's why he wrapped my long hair in his coat." "Mr. Southern." Hearing Mahina's voice, Cameron turned her head around, only to see Mahina running straight out of a car. She ran up to Cameron and took a better look at her. Seeing that she looked flustered, she asked worriedly, "Are you all right?" Cameron waved. "I'm fine. Have you been looking for us? Mahina responded with a smile. Jake guessed that you should have gotten into the fishing village and hidden yourselves there, so he ordered us to stay on guard at the city gate. Thank God that you're both fine. Knowles got out of the car at that moment. Waylon walked up to him. Where's Daisy? She's in the hospital, he replied. Waylon frowned. What happened to her? Knowles shook his head. It's not her. It's Mr. Southern Sr. Cameron, who just so happened to walk up to the both of them at this time, heard what Knowles said, and her expression changed slightly as she dashed forward. What happened to my father? Mahina quickly explained. Mr. Southern Sr. went to the hospital yesterday to visit Mr. Serrano and was discovered by Manuel. Mr. Southern Sr. fought with Manuel's men but was ambushed and got injured. He's fine, however. Miss Vanderbilt has been taking care of Mr. Southern Sr. in the hospital after notifying us about the incident. Cameron heaved a sigh of relief, and her gaze turned cold instantly. It's Manuel's doing, huh? I'll settle the score with him when I get back. Mahina saw the 2 chicken cages in her hand. Mr. Southern, these are. Only then did Cameron hand the 2 cages to Mahina. Bring these back and get our cooks to make some chicken broth and dishes for Mr. Goldman to make up for his injuries. He's been severely injured. Cameron did not wait for them and left the scene first. Knowles and Mahina looked at Waylon at the same time. He did not look like he had been seriously injured. Cameron went back, took a shower, changed into some clean clothes, and went to the hospital with her men immediately. She pushed open the door of the ward. Father. Sonny was sitting on the hospital bed, eating congee, and raised his head when he heard Cameron's voice. You seem fine. Chapter 2119. Cameron sat down in the chair next to the bed. What would happen to me? But things are different with you. You're not as young as you used to be now, so what you should do is escape when you find yourself in a sticky situation. What were you thinking, going head to head with Manuel's men? Sonny put down the bowl in his hand. I'm fine. You and Wayne are the ones that I worry about. I can finally rest assured now that you two are all right. Cameron crossed her arms and did not utter a single word. By the way, thanks to Daisy, we managed to catch 2 bastards who tried to take advantage of the situation that we're in. Jokin is still alive, so I'm sure that Manuel will definitely think about assassinating him again. Cameron looked at him. So you're the one who saved him? No wonder. He explained earnestly, Cam, no matter what happened between the serpents and us before this, Jokin is still the head of the Serrano. He'll be able to help us to some extent in the future. In the face of Fabio's ambition, we can't afford to take things lightly. As for Manuel, it's time to get rid of him for good. Apart from the ventilation openings, no light could shine into the basement of the commune. The walls were all dark and damp, and there were cockroaches crawling in the corners. Several men were tied to posts and had been brutally beaten before this, their faces were bruised and swollen. The door was abruptly opened, and Cameron stepped into the room slowly. One of the men opened his eyes, and his dry lips moved. You're still alive. The subordinate standing behind Cameron stepped forward and kicked him in the abdomen. How dare you question our young master's ability to survive your ambush? The man vomited on the spot, and veins could be seen bulging on his forehead and neck. Cameron covered her mouth and nose in disgust. You're not dead, so how could I die before you do? That'll be so disrespectful. The man was in so much distress that he could not even speak. One of the subordinates brought Cameron a stool. She sat down and crossed her legs. You guys have grown into a presumptuous gang. You actually have the guts to attack my father while I'm not around. You even hurt my father. I guess you must have grown tired of living and don't want to see tomorrow's sunrise already. The man did not speak. Cameron turned her head and said to her men. Where's the box of precious babies that we raise? Bring them out and show them to our guests. Those men were astounded for a moment and then nodded. Yes, sir. Two of the men brought a large box in, which seemed quite heavy. Cameron got up, walked to the box, and patted it. As long as you give me the name of the supporting Manuel from behind the curtains, I'll make sure that you won't have to suffer. The man gnashed his teeth and refused to speak. Cameron opened the lid of the box, and inside it was a densely packed swarm of venomous scorpions. The man gulped his saliva out of fear when he saw the scene, and beads of cold sweat rolled down from the sides of his forehead. Rumor had it that the young master of the Southern had a perverted mind and had many ways to torture others. In particular, he loved to watch as scorpions crawled all over his captives' bodies and got into their clothes. It was totally mental torture. These are venomous scorpions. They are very ruthless and really into stinging. Cameron took the tweezers handed over by her subordinates and picked up a huge scorpion out of the cyclone. The sharp sting on the tip of its tail was clearly in vision. Cameron approached the man. The latter felt numb all over his body, and his face gradually paled. "Little cutie pie, be good and sting him." Cameron placed the scorpion on the man's shoulder, and when the scorpion crawled closer, the man could not take it anymore. Mr. Southern. I really don't know who's supporting Manuel from the shadows. He's never told us about that. Ever since he took over the serpents, all we've done is follow his orders. Don't you people have any doubts about Manuel taking over the serpents? She looked indifferent and calm. The man gulped his saliva as the scorpion climbed up to his neck. He trembled vigorously but did not dare to move a muscle. We're suspecting things, but we don't dare to speak up. After all, this is a position that Mr. Puzo handed directly to him. We can only obey. Chapter 2120. Cameron picked up the scorpion with a tweezer and placed it on the back of her hand. The scorpion crawled slowly but did not sting her. The man's scalp went numb just by looking at it. There's actually someone in this world who keeps venomous scorpions as pets. This is so perverted. Cameron saw his gaze, understood what he was thinking, and sneered. I can let you go, but I need you to do me a favor. If you can accomplish the task, you'll be rewarded. But if you don't, I'll give you a taste of a venomous scorpion bath. The man bit the bullet and asked, What do you want me to do? It's very simple. Spread the fact that Joaquin Serrano is still alive to the public, including Manuel's intention to murder him. Cameron approached him. Can you do that? He nodded hurriedly. Yes. Cameron asked her subordinates to untie him. After the man was released, he fled immediately for fear that Cameron would go back on her word. Cameron came out of the commune, and Mahina was waiting for her at the door. She did not get anyone to stop the man who ran out just now because she knew that Cameron must have let him go on purpose. Young master, will he betray us? Cameron opened the car door and got in the car. What can he do to betray us? I only asked him to spread the news that Joaquin is still alive. So, when the men working for the serpents know that Manuel intends to kill their former boss, will they still trust him? Even if Fabio and the people behind him supported Manuel, the people in the serpents would never turn to him anymore. She wanted to get rid of Manuel slowly but steadily. It would be best if she could kill two birds with one stone and find out who was the person supporting Manuel from behind. Waylon was changing his bandages and ointment alone in the room when Daisy opened the door, smelled the odor of the ointment, and was surprised. Waylon, are you injured? He bit the bandage and tied the knot of the bandage with the other hand. I'm fine. It's just a flesh wound. No, a flesh injury is still an injury. You have to go to the hospital for an examination. She walked into the room and wanted to drag him out after saying that. However, instead of Daisy managing to pull Waylon out of the room, he grabbed her on the wrist. Daisy, I'm really fine. Cameron has already helped me with the wound before this. Daisy's eyes went from side to side, and she suddenly gave in. Oh, then it should be fine. Waylon lifted his gaze and stared at her. What's the matter? Now she moved to the side, sat down, and pursed her lips. Thank God Cameron was there. Isn't she very awesome? He responded with a hum as he packed the first aid kit. Yeah, she's pretty awesome. Daisy leaned closer to him and winked. Just how amazing is she? He was stunned for a split second, turned his head to the side, stared at her expectant gaze, raised his hand, and knocked the top of her head with his knuckle. Just what are you thinking? She scratched her head, pouted, and did not utter a single word. Waylon is way too shrewd. I can't ask him too many questions. Waylon got up and put the first aid kit away. You and Cameron have only known each other for a month, and you've gotten so close to her? Daisy giggled. Of course. You won't understand it. This is the friendship between ladies. Waylon turned around and glanced at her. It seems that you like her very much. Daisy did not deny it, got up, and walked to the window. I like everyone that treats me well. Besides, you can consider her as my master in martial arts. Thinking of something, she turned around abruptly. By the way, has Aunt Sadie been protecting us secretly? Waylon nodded. Her current identity impedes her from appearing in front of us, but it's thanks to you this time around. He then walked up to Daisy, raised his hand, and rubbed the top of her head. I've always been worried that they'll make a move on the Southern clan when we're not here, and you might not be able to handle it alone when the time comes. Fortunately, you've done the Southern clan a tiny favor this time around. Daisy lowered her gaze. That's thanks to Aunt Sadie too. Without Aunt Sadie's text message, I would have no idea that Mr. Southern Sr. was in danger.